Go then, preach the good news about the realm. Do not lay down any rule beyond what I have determined for you, nor grow the law like a lawgiver, or else you will be dominated by it. For the word of God in us, with us, and through us, thanks be to God. This Sunday is the official Mary Magdalene feast day in church calendars that aren't usually Methodist. So we're on the edge. I know that's new for us. So just take a deep breath. But we're probably not going to read the sermon of Pope Gregory the Great when he discerned to make Mary Magdalene a sex worker, and then started a whole craze in Europe that blossomed and grew with all of these traditions and stories and narratives about her being lifted up 7 times a day by 7 angels to preach, and then still at the end of the day telling people to go listen to the good man named Peter in Rome, like a good girl. We're going to invite this story from her gospel, or what's left of it, what we have, what was found and refound and buried away in a time when all of the stories that didn't conform to what would be included in the canon needed to be hidden to be saved. And so that's how we have it, through this gift of someone hiding them away, and then this surprise of the right person finding it who might actually know that this is something. And so here we are, 2,000 years later, listening to her story, listening to her voice. And I want to invite us first into the Gospel of Luke, where Luke says Mary called Magdalene. And Magdalene in Aramaic means tower. There have been scholars who talk about a village that maybe she came from, and maybe she did. But I want to invite us to explore her as Mary the tower, the one that you look to, the one that's steady and solid, the one that withstands the storms and stays present. She's about this presence and practice of love over and over and over, even if it is whispered through 2,000 years of church patriarchy. Last spring, I was speaking at a women's conference at a church in West Omaha. And at the end of my 45-minute talk about Mary Magdalene, where I shared some of the highlights of my Lenten sermon series, and some research that it was maybe new and slightly overwhelming, but received with good care because I'm small and not very threatening. Thank you. Most of the time. I'm leaving this worship space. I'm leaving the sanctuary. People are greeting each other and me, and I'm walking out when suddenly a sweet little old lady transforms in front of me and puts her body between me and the door where I'm trying to get to so that I can go sell our books to the people who might be interested in buying the books. And she says, Lazarus was disabled. And I said, oh, hi. Hi. And then she says, well, you didn't know Lazarus was disabled? And I was like, I did not. I have not read that. I don't know about that. She's like, well, that's why Martha could invite Jesus into her home with authority, because her brother Lazarus was disabled. And I said, okay, I just haven't read that ever. And I don't know, so I don't think I could, I don't know. And then she says, well, it's true. And I said, okay. She's like, so do you understand now? And I was like, I thought about just like, yep, you're right, I'm going. I also thought, or was tempted for a moment to, lay down 15 years of theological ministry and my credentials And then I said, again, I've not read that. So I don't think I can make a comment about how I would feel about that. When I was talking about Martha as it relates to understanding Mary Magdalene, I know that raised a lot of big questions and that it might be unnerving when we have a lot of big questions raised, and that's okay. Like, you don't have to agree or disagree or let go of this Lazarus thing if you don't want to. It's okay. And then she huffed. And I said, I really need to get to the books. People, I got a job. So I went to the books, and then she followed me to the books. And then she looked at the books, and which book was telling you about this? And I was like, well, here are 5 or 6 books that you might find interesting. And so she fingered through them and took one here and then set it back down and then took another one and set it back down. And then she joined a small group that was discussing it to tell them why I was wrong because Lazarus was disabled. And they were like, okay, because this isn't the ditch they're going to die in. And then she left that group, and then she came back over and got another book and then set it back down, and it was just going nowhere. I apologized to my friend Chris because I assumed this woman was a member of her congregation and that likely this was going to come back to really haunt her. And Chris looked at her and said, yeah, she's not mine, so I don't know who's going to have to work with that. And then she just left. Like, she didn't stay for the rest of the conversation at all. And I went home and I looked up, Lazarus is disabled, ? And sure enough, you can find a number of blogs about Lazarus and these theories that Lazarus is disabled, right? He dies and Jesus brings him back to life in the Gospel of John, and maybe Jesus waited too long. Like, that's legit in these blogs. There's all kinds of theories about what kind of disability Lazarus might have had, including cognitive disabilities and physical disabilities. And then one goes so far as to say that Mary, his sister, also has a disability. And I'm like, I'm not sure, what we're doing here. And maybe these are well-intentioned efforts to talk about ableism. Or they could be. Maybe they could be well-intentioned efforts to talk about ableism in our culture, present, and our cultures that we inherited from the past. But most of them were not. It was a way to explain away this little piece of reality that Martha shouldn't have had authority. And I'm just not sure which is the trump card in Roman society. Sexism or ableism, which one's stronger? But what I shared then, and what I've shared before, I want to share one more time, which is this emerging study. There had been scholars who studied Mary Magdalene in depth, and not Dan Brown, contrary to some folks. Scholars who have studied Mary Magdalene, who've talked about how people following Jesus and people in our tradition have this spiritual transformation and their names change. We inherit this. Sarah and Abraham, they don't start as Sarah and Abraham. Jacob wrestles with God and becomes Israel, the central identity of the people to follow. Saul is breathing threats of murder, and then something like scales fall from his eyes, and his name is Paul. Peter didn't start out as Peter. His brother brought him to meet Jesus, and Andrew always stays Andrew, but Simon becomes Peter the Rock. Mary, possibly Mary of Bethany, has an experience that is the same and becomes Mary, the one called Magdalene, just like in the Gospel of Luke. The one who worked through her seven demons, the one who fuels and funds, the one who shows up, the one who stays there during the worst parts of Jesus' life and death, the one who is at the tomb, who does the work, who is there for all of it. Mary the Tower. And the thing that pushes this even further is that a grad student was looking at manuscripts that had just been digitized. And the oldest copy of the Gospel of John that we have in this in our ability to research comes to her attention. It's from 200 years after Jesus' death. 2,000 would be right now, anyway. And right there, in front of God and everybody, somebody edited the Gospel of John. Knowingly, actively, without shame or out regret, without trying to hide it, crosses out some of the Marys in the text, writes Martha in between the lines, and then when it says Lazarus' sister, it becomes plural, sisters. This doesn't take Martha away from the Gospel of Luke, but it does raise questions about how we have identified this family attached to Lazarus. The other thing that is right there in front of us is that in the Gospel of Luke, Mary and Martha are of a certain village. And certainly the author of Luke knows where Bethany is. Bethany is always Jesus' favorite hangout. It says of a certain village, and based on where Jesus is working at that point in the story, it doesn't make sense for it to be Bethany. The other part of this information that has always intrigued scholars is that the story about Jesus raising Lazarus, that's a big deal. Every pastor is going to preach on it. Those early church fathers, they preached on it too. And most of them only talk about Mary and Lazarus. Lazarus has a sister named Mary. Maybe Tertullian's Gospel of John only had Mary. This raises so many questions. And even modern scholars are trying to discern what to do with this story. Do you edit a story again after 2,000 years? It invites us, at the very least, to wonder, to think, to be open to what Mary teaches us, invites in us. It invites us to wonder why they want to lessen Mary's voice, to split up her lines between two women. It invites us to look at the timeline of when this is happening and what is happening in the context, how this diversity of early Christian communities has some folks who write women should be silent in church, and other churches that are led by women like Lydia. They are not one monolithic community. They are not an identity born around this list of attributes or this list of right living or these certain creeds. They are diverse and wildly different from each other. And as they grow connected to the empire, they have to become more centralized. This is where orthodoxy emerges, and it emerges in opposition and in silencing and in naming folks as heretics. It emerges, and then it sends some scriptures into hiding. It emerges, and it sends some people away. Somehow this community that was about practice becomes about right answers. Somehow this community that was about exploring the ancient words and how they might live them becomes about absolutes. Somehow it becomes about creeds instead of courage and compassion. It is hard for us when we encounter new information, when we encounter new people, when we encounter something that's outside of the norms or the boundaries or our experiences that we are so quick to label and judge. And it's not just in church. It's It's in our political landscape. It's in our cultural landscape. It is in all these places where I think it is genuine work for us to stay open, for us to offer compassion, for us to be curious instead of quick to judge. And that work can be daunting. But I think that's the legacy that Mary Magdalene leaves us on her feast day. This practice, this presence. It's not about easy or absolute answers. It is about this daily presence of showing up in hard spaces. May we have the courage. May it be so. Amen.